Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you here to our Scripture and Ministry lecture, part of the series. It's sponsored by the Henry Center for Theological Understanding. And it's our privilege today to have Dr. Craig Carter, who's with us. He's a professor of religious studies at Tyndale University College in Toronto. And he is here to speak to us on a topic which has remained the same, but the title is different due to the as he mentioned it, the increasing significance of Augustine in the issue topic that he was addressing. So you're not in the wrong place. Hopefully you're in the right place, and we're glad to have you here with us. Dr. Carter teaches courses in theology, Christianity and culture, and ethics. He's taught philosophy and religion as well in Atlantic Baptist University, and he's also been a vice president and an academic dean at Atlantic Baptist University and also at Tyndale University College, where he is now. He has served as a pastor for 7 years in a Baptist church in Prince Edward Island and Moncton, New Brunswick. He's also very actively committed to the church. He's a churchman. And he is functioning as a theologian in residence at his home church, Westney Heights Baptist Church, where he says he preaches every month. He's involved in deacons' meetings. He does book reviews for church leaders and regularly teaches Sunday school as well. I think this is an expression of his conviction that theology is done from the church and for the church and is for the people of God, not just for, academics and the academic elite. So he makes a perfect candidate for coming and speaking to us in the Scripture and Ministry lecture series. We're very glad to have him. His area of specialization is in systematic theology, particularly Karl Barth, Christianity and culture, and especially and particularly the thought of Niebuhr, John Howard Yoder, and Leslie Newbigin. And he's also written on the history of Christian perspectives on war and peace. You may know him from his books, Brazos Press, The Politics of the Cross, The Theology and Social Ethics of John Howard Yoder, and also Rethinking Christ and Culture, also by Brazos Press, a Post-Christendom Perspective. He's currently writing on a project for InterVarsity on Trinitarian theology and the human person, and he is an active thinker, blogger, one who engages with culture, and he has a blog that's called Politics of the Cross Resurrected, no spaces. Today's lecture is Augustine and the Secular in the Christendom and Modernity. We're very glad to have Dr. Carter with us. Would you please join me in welcoming him?
Well, I'm really glad to be here. Thank you so much to those who have invited me and to the warm hospitality that I've experienced here. I feel very much at home. Tyndale has many things in common with Trinity, and it's good to be here. I'm going to try to stick to my script because I'm used to teaching in 3-hour blocks, and to stop after an hour is really hard for me, so I'll try not to get carried away. I bring you greetings from my country, Canada, where the secularization of culture has now progressed to the point where the early persecution of the church has now begun. You could think of me as an emissary from your future, here to warn you not to sell your freedom for a cheap meal from the welfare state or to trade your freedom for the promise of state-enforced equality. In this lecture, I want to talk about Augustine and the concept of the secular, both in Christendom and in modernity. And I want to begin by explaining how my thinking has been evolving and changing over the past few years. I thought of giving this another title. I thought of calling it How I Lost My Faith in Social Justice. For most of the last 25 years, I would have described myself as theologically conservative and politically liberal. Although I've always been conservative on marriage and sanctity of life issues, I have followed Ron Sider and Jim Wallace in favor of social justice for the poor as a Christian response to the issue of poverty. But during the last 5 years, I've begun to question the whole concept of social justice. So I've been influenced by people like John Howard Yoder and people like Karl Barth. But on the right, I've also been influenced by people like Schaeffer and John Paul II and Augustine. When I wrote my book, Rethinking Christ and Culture, I was attempting to combine Nicene orthodoxy with a Christological pacifism derived from John Howard Yoder. My main concern was to disconnect orthodoxy from the union of church and state in Christendom that resulted in the church dominating the state and ruling over society by the use of force. My earlier book on Yoder was an attempt to interpret Yoder as an orthodox pacifist whose view of Jesus was rooted in the New Testament and consistent with creedal orthodoxy. Now, I was disappointed with the reaction to my book, Rethinking Christ and Culture. It wasn't just that the liberals liked it and the conservatives generally, for the most part, ignored it, but the bigger problem was the context into which it was born made it almost inevitable that it would be misinterpreted. I think there are two trends that made this pretty much inevitable. Number one is the trend that the book tended to get swallowed up in the widespread shift to the left during the Bush years. Tony Campolo, Brian McLaren, and Jim Wallace supported the Democratic Party in the last election cycle, and in order to do so, they downplayed their opposition to abortion and their support for marriage as the bedrock of society. And the language of Christendom and Constantinianism has now entered the theological lexicon. And these words are taken to mean that any time Christians stand for and defend, say, laws that defend marriage or the family or the sanctity of life, when there is a great deal of secular resistance to those laws, so when Christians appear to be promoting and defending laws that are strongly resisted by non-Christians in society, that is understood to be Constantinian. That is understood to be the church imposing its will upon society in an illegitimate way. And I don't think that's what Constantinianism really means for John Howard Yoder. And I don't think that those are very good ways to use those words, but I think those words are used those ways frequently. The second trend is that recent scholarship on the theology of Yoder tends to take Yoder and the development of Yoder's thought in a very classically liberal Protestant direction. A book of essays, for example, by a group of younger scholars at the university that came out of a conference held in Toronto back in 2007. This book, Powers and Practices, Engaging the Work of John Howard Yoder, just came out this year. I have a blurb on the back. And, blurbs, of course, are supposed to be polite. But if you read my blurb, you can tell that I'm a bit unsettled by the trends that I see in the interpretation of Yoder in this book. For example, people are saying, we can't really take Yoder seriously and really believe that God would have commanded the Israelites to exterminate the Canaanites. You've got to understand that as sub-Christian, and it may call into question the authority of the Old Testament, but it's too bad you have to do that. You can't really understand God as a God of wrath. The idea of God punishing his son on the cross, that has to go. The whole idea of substitutionary atonement is very dubious, and so on. This is what I mean by taking Yoder interpretation in a theologically liberal direction. So because it was published in the midst of the leftward shift in evangelicalism, and in the context of the move toward a liberal interpretation of Yoder, my book was misinterpreted as a cautious endorsement of those trends rather than as a challenge to them. And so, but the awkward question that I had to ask myself was this really a misinterpretation of my book? Was it really true that the ignoring of the orthodox thrust of my book was really being unfair to my book? Or was it actually the case that the interpretation of my book was justified because what I was trying to do in that book was to hold together in a unity two unstable elements, namely the ideals of social justice and conservative theology? Is it really possible for evangelicals who wish to remain orthodox to embrace a liberal politics? And this question has been the question that has been at the forefront of my mind over the past 3 or 4 years. And I've begun to read widely in conservative political thought. And it has caused me to reflect on the meaning of certain recent events. For example, as I watch Sojourners evolve in the direction that it has gone over the last few years, the unflinching, unquestioning support of Sojourners for Obama's statist agenda, it raises a lot of questions for me. The fixation of Sojourners on the state as the source of our hope for social justice. Jim Wallace, his focus is not on the church, it's on the state. When he spoke in Toronto a few years ago, it was very clear to me that the function of the church is it's a place to get to mobilize opinion and to rouse voters to vote for a certain political agenda. But the real action in terms of helping the poor, the real action in terms of changing the world, was going to happen through the state, not through the church. That unsettles me a great deal. I had a rather emotional reaction to the hatchet job done on Sarah Palin by the media last year. Sarah Palin could be the mother of one of the students in my classes. I have lots of Pentecostal students in my classes. Sarah Palin was not some alien presence from another planet. I understood where Sarah Palin comes from. She's just a Pentecostal, evangelical, middle-class woman with a rural background. I relate to all that. And where did this visceral hate for all things evangelical come from? It wasn't about her politics, really. It was some more about the way that it was okay in liberal elite circles to really hate what she was and stood for and to attack her family and all of that. I asked myself, where's that coming from? And what's it really directed against? Is it really because she's a Republican? Is it really because she bumped the McCain ticket up in the polls? Or is there more there? Is there more animosity toward evangelicalism there than maybe we think? And then, this has been a big one for me, the persecution of Christians in Canada. You may think I'm overstating this or that I'm exaggerating, but the Orwellian named human rights commissions in Canada are totally out of control. They have the right to charge people and to convict them if anyone says anything that another person interprets as being hurtful. Truth is no defense. That's nothing to do with it. If you say something and someone claims to have been hurt by it and they call you before one of these commissions, you can be hounded and you can be eventually, many bad things can happen to you. You can be fined. A pastor in Alberta wrote a letter to the Red Deer Advocate criticizing the introduction of the pro-homosexual agenda into public schools in Alberta. This was middle, junior high school level that he's talking about. And a person took him before the Alberta Human Rights Commission. He was convicted, and he was fined $7,000, and he was ordered never to speak negatively about homosexuality again in public. He was also ordered to write a letter of apology and recant his views, even though he clearly hadn't changed his mind. This is almost difficult to believe. All that's missing here is the gulag. We in Canada have a tremendously, the ironic thing about that story, the Human Rights Commission ordered him to pay the $7,000 fine to a homosexual advocacy group in Toronto called EGAL. The group wrote back and said, we don't want the money. We're not in favor of suppressing free speech. We hate what he's saying. We think it's wrong. But we remember that not too long ago, we didn't have free speech, and so we're in favor of free speech for everybody. Even the homosexual advocacy groups thought that the Human Rights Commissions had gone too far. And yet, they do all kinds of utterly insane things, and the usual principles of law and justice don't apply. You're not entitled to confront your accuser. You're not entitled to have legal representation. They can take as long as they want to torment you and then drop you after you've spent a couple $100,000 on legal defense, and there's nothing you can do about it.